Welcome to the Denison Forum podcast. I'm Dr. Mark Turman, Executive Director of Denison Forum, sitting down again with Dr. Jim Denison, the CEO of Denison Ministries and cultural apologist here with us at Denison Forum. Good morning, Jim. How are you?
Good to see you today, Mark. How are you?
Doing great. This is a special edition of the Denison Forum podcast based on breaking news. Just to give a little bit of context, I was about to go to sleep last night. Usually turn the television off just after listening to the first couple of headlines and what the weather is going to be. I know you, Jim, go to bed a little bit earlier than that. But the news broke with a story that the news source Politico had gained an early draft brief written apparently in February from the Supreme Court, indicating that the court was possibly going to or likely to overturn Roe versus Wade when it delivers its official decision later this summer. I didn't catch you. I sent you a text just in case you didn't catch it, but you were up earlier than I was. And so that's really what the context of this podcast is all about. Obviously, a very, very important issue. We want to point our listeners to a very significant resource that you put out on the web about 2 years ago. They can find it at denisonforum.org. If you simply put in the title, "What Does the Bible Say About Abortion?" you'll get this white paper, part of which we'll talk about today in this context. But you started that paper off 2 years ago. You said in other places as well that abortion is the defining issue of our day. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, thank you for that, Mark, and thank you for this conversation as well. I typically write a draft of the daily article the day before, and then when I got up this morning at 4 o'clock, everything changed. So we obviously started over, wrote an article specifically on this, and that's what this conversation's about as well. I'm sure I'll be writing about this in days to come as well. But back to your specific question, I believe it is the defining issue because this is life and death on a level that really very few other things we're discussing are. We could talk about same-sex marriage. We could talk about right and left issues in the context of political spectrum. There are a variety of things that are very divisive in the culture.
Partisanship generally.
In general, I could talk about postmodernism on a variety of levels, but none of those have to do with life itself. Abortion, I believe, is the taking of a human life. I believe life begins at conception. I believe abortion is therefore in principle wrong. I believe that from 1973 until today, the United States has legally ended more than 60 million lives. I go to Israel multiple times a year, as you know. We typically go to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum. I weep every time I go. But in tragic terms, more than 10 times more babies have been aborted in the United States than were murdered in the Holocaust.
Which is just such a huge number that it's just even hard to really get your mind around it.
It really is. It's staggering, really.
When we talk about the Holocaust, we talk about all of World War II or other wars such as Vietnam. We talk about deaths to COVID, obviously, very much on our mind. The numbers for me have always, and this has been a very significant issue for me since the earliest days when I became a Christian and back in the early 80s, and just where this conversation and where this struggle and what you could even call spiritual warfare in some ways has been a part of my experience my whole life, and certainly my whole Christian life. My church, when I was a young Christian, was trying to help us understand this, help us to pray through this, help us to respond to this, and it became a very significant issue for me even from those early days. And I've had the opportunity to work in this space, to be a part, to lead a board in a crisis pregnancy center in my community, to be involved in that way for a number of years, to lead our church, to be involved and to be supportive of those that were trying to help people in the midst of unplanned pregnancy to choose life, either to parent that child or to place that child in a loving adoption, to do all that we could in the midst of this incredible battle. But today's and this week's experience relative to this story obviously is a very big pivot point potentially on several fronts. So let's see if we can take our time and frame this for our listeners, and also, again, point them to other resources, the article, the white paper that we have, and other things that are on our website, as well as other things that you've written. Let's kind of back up a moment. Because you're a cultural apologist, because you're trying to pay very close attention to what's moving in the world and helping us to understand it in a biblical lens, tell us just briefly, what is the source, Politico? Some of us hear that name, particularly if you're listening to politics carefully. The first kind of question that seemed to come out of the newscasters last night as I listened was, well, we're not sure if this is a credible thing or not. Help us understand it from that standpoint. Does this sound credible to you? And then related to that, this very interesting, if not disturbing reality that we've never seen something like this leaked out of the Supreme Court before they're ready to make their opinion known.
Yeah, that really is unprecedented. You're right, exactly so. So first of all, as to Politico. Politico is a news organization, a news outlet. It was founded in 2007 in Virginia, although it's international in its scope. But as the name would imply, it focuses primarily on political stories, focuses on politics, on policy issues such as that. Strives to be the first to break news in that context. That's its wheelhouse, is to be at the leading edge, it would say, of political stories of consequence and significance. That's what it exists to do. And so what it did last night is consistent with what it would see as that mission. Now, for those that might be interested, it is typically considered to be a left-leaning organization in terms of its particular bias relative to the stories it covers and the way in which it covers these stories, for whatever that is worth. As regards the legitimacy of what it has reported here, from everything I can tell, from everybody that has read the actual report, I've read through it myself, this certainly appears to be an actual document written by Samuel Alito, one of the Supreme Court justices, in February as a draft document relative to the upcoming decision that should be announced this coming June. So the background here is last December, the court heard a case that could overturn Roe v. Wade in terms of the nature of the course of the case from Mississippi itself. And so shortly after the court hears oral arguments, typically they will gather together in a conference and they'll take a vote as to where they are on this issue. They'll get to a majority-minority position. At that point, if the Chief Justice is in the majority, he will typically select one person in the majority, himself or somebody else, to write a draft report, a draft opinion for the majority. And those that are in the minority can begin making decisions as to whether they will write dissenting opinions or not. And so apparently that would have happened back in December. Apparently, Justice Alito was the person selected to write the majority opinion, which causes some to think that Chief Justice Roberts was not in the majority. If that's the case, if he's not in the majority, then the senior justice in the majority makes that decision. In this case, it would have been Clarence Thomas. Would have perhaps, if we connect the dots properly, would then have been the person to select Justice Alito to write this majority draft. But however it came about, it does appear to be legitimate. And so he would have written it last February. It would be circulated among the justices as a starting point as they make their own decisions in this case. They apparently, from the report, and again, it's unnamed sources, they voted again this past week and came to the same apparent position that the report seems to indicate, that there are 5 justices that are for overturning Roe v. Wade. There are 3 that are opposed, and we're not certain where Chief Justice Roberts is. At last report, it seems that he was willing to uphold the Dobbs position of December that would limit abortion rights, but was not willing to overturn Roe v. Wade completely. It seems perhaps could be the case as regards where he himself is in this. But because this was leaked in an unprecedented fashion, we have shortcut the process here. It's typically the case that these justices will look at these reports, they'll consider these things, they'll have further discussions. They sometimes change their votes. I read just today that back in 1992, when Casey was decided, which upheld Roe v. Wade, early votes were that it would overturn Roe v. Wade. And then toward the very end of the process, some of the votes changed as the justices discussed these things among themselves, which is what they're supposed to do.
That's the kind of deliberation
That's the
It's
process.
not simply
That's right.
that they listen to the moral arguments coming from the opposing sides that are in front of them. They have conversation, discussion, debate, even among themselves.
And that is even more formative,
Right.
typically, because they're going to do the deep dive. I mean, this is a very extensive, 118 footnotes, extremely well researched, and it's written not only to express a majority opinion, but perhaps to persuade others. And so they very much attempt to persuade each other in the context of the 9 justices. And all of this is intended to be an internal discussion relative to an actual finding that wasn't supposed to be released until June.
So if I hear you right, we're just looking at the credibility of the source, Politico, to what we can know about that. But then if you look at the timing of it, and we're trying to do what probably the reporters at Politico were doing, which is, okay, December, February, and now we're at the 1st of May. Okay, well, if all of this process of discussion, deliberation, determining who's in what camp, and the initial formation of, like I said, a document of this size with this many footnotes, that kind of thing, this thoroughly, you can kind of see that, okay, well, at least from that standpoint, it looks credible.
Very much so.
That it has lined up this way. Talk a little bit about what you've discovered and gained so far about this whole reality of this potential leak.
It's massive and it's horrific. It's absolutely horrific. I'm seeing language about this in some of the reporting that's calling it not only unprecedented, but an earthquake. Some are calling it a crisis for the Supreme Court itself. And it's really on 3 levels. The first level has to do with the degree to which somebody that had access to this actually chose to leak it. There are being calls right now that if that was a clerk, they should be fired. If that was an attorney, they should be disbarred. If it was a justice, they should be impeached. That it's on that level of violating the sanctity of the process, as it were, for whatever purpose. And you can argue both sides of that. Right. Some that would say they're trying to get one of the justices to change their position. Others that are saying, no, they're trying to get the justices to solidify their position now that it's public.
Is there political wrangling going in some way?
All of those questions, yeah. And then you've got midterm elections. There are some that are already saying this will dominate the midterm elections. Some will say this will help the Democrats because now there's a belief that if this, in fact, does become the court's position, it'll return the abortion rights issues to the states. And so now you've got midterm elections, and now we've got to elect Democrats to support abortion. There's an argument to overturn the filibuster so that we could federalize abortion and make it something that the Congress passes as opposed to the courts. There's all sorts of politics inside this. And so all that's just being guessed at right now. But the first answer to your question is that this is devastating relative to the nature of the court itself. Second, it's going to be devastating relative to the protection of the court. As soon as this leak became public, barricades went up around the Supreme Court building.
Right. You can see photographs of that on every news source right now.
And already there are demonstrations outside the court. There are already horrific calls on the part especially of those on the left, those that are upset about this ruling, to burn down the court, to attack the justices, at least rhetorically, if not personally. There's already concern about the safety of the Supreme Court justices between now and June in light of all of this. And so there's actually a security issue inside all of this. And then the third piece inside this is the degree to which whoever released this believes in a post-truth culture that they themselves can take, in essence, the entire process into their hands. That is indicative of a culture which is deciding, I have my truth, you have your truth, I can do what I want to do. And truth is what I believe it to be. Morality is whatever works for me. And this expresses that kind of absolute rejection of objective truth, which is the basis for the way that we do governance in this country. It's terrifying on several levels.
Right. Well, I know that, that's just something that's just astounding, really. Yeah. And I know something that you're thinking and working and writing on more. So would encourage folks to stay with us, to keep following daily articles and other things on our website, because there'll be more to come on that issue as well as many of these issues. But want to come back around to just the whole essence of the conversation itself, which is what you and I have talked about. We'll get down to this point, which is this a child or not? But even before 1973, abortion existed, and in various forms, going back not just hundreds of years, but even thousands of years, about the way people looked at children and looked at pregnancy and looked at what their rights and responsibilities might be in those kinds of situations. What I love about your work in this area and this, particularly this white paper that you wrote, is it's not just simple. It's not something that can be boiled down to something you can put on a poster board. That there's a lot more here to consider, a lot more to understand. And as I just heard somebody you and I both respect say, if the issue is important enough for you to have an opinion, you need to do your homework on both sides. So let's talk about that a minute. How, as strongly as you and I believe in the right to life, we believe that life begins at the moment of conception. We do have others that we know and that we would care for and respect who would have opposing opinions. The moral arguments for abortion. Walk us through that and how we who take a pro-life position would respond to those arguments.
Yeah, thank you. The first thing to understand is that really it's not just pro-life and pro-choice. As you know, there really are 4 different positions that have been taken here over the years. One is that there should be no right to an abortion at all, not even to save the life of the mother. Purely, simple, full stop, no right to.
And that's typically the Roman Catholic position.
That has been typically the case. Yeah, that's not always the case. It's not entirely uniform, but that's been typically the case, at least on a doctrinal level. Maybe not so much in Catholic hospitals when it comes to the actual moment of the decision, but that's been more the doctrinal position. The doctrinal position is that no right to abortion at all. A second position is called therapeutic abortion, which would be the allowance for abortion to save a mother's life, specifically to save her life, not relative to her mental health, not relative to her financial health. That would be more how Roe v. Wade argued, but her actual physical life. If she's going to die, if she gives birth to this child, perhaps she has cancer and she needs cancer treatments. If perhaps the actual birth process itself is going to create a bleeding that can't be stopped, something like that.
And we have that idea because we now have medical advances that tell us that there's a high probability or possibility that could happen.
That she actually can't bear the child itself. Right. There can be breach, there can be things such as that. And so if the mother will die, then this is called a therapeutic abortion. And there are many that would consider that to be a moral position. A third would be what's called extreme case abortions. And here you're thinking about rape, you're thinking about incest, you're thinking about severe deformity incompatible with life. And even inside that, there are positions. There are some that would allow for abortion in the case of fetal deformity incompatible with life if the baby is simply not going to survive anyway. That would not allow for abortion in the case of rape and incest. Others that would allow for abortion in the case of all 3. And so there are various positions even inside all that. And then, of course, the fourth position is that abortion should be available to any woman who chooses it. That would be the pro-choice position. And even there's nuance. There's some that would say that there should be abortion allowed prior to viability, whatever viability is considered to be. And that can be when the baby could live outside the womb. That prior to that, abortion should be legal, but if the baby would survive the abortion, then the abortion not be performed. There would others, the heartbeat bills that you've heard about, that abortion not be allowed once a heartbeat can be detected. Well, that's typically at 6 to 8 weeks, depending, and oftentimes the mother doesn't even know she's pregnant at that point, so-called heartbeat bills. And so there are nuances inside all of this to make the point.
And as we've talked about, just to set a little bit of a wider context before we get into some of the more specific moral arguments for abortion, is to help our listeners understand what is a relatively, what in my mind is short history of not only abortion and pregnancy and sexuality rights and all that, but just even if you just kind of set 100-year or so framework around the acceleration of pornography, going back to Hugh Hefner, as we've talked about in your Tsunami book, back in the 50s, the arrival of birth control in pill form in the 60s. You can kind of see that all a rising tide of conversation, debate, and discussion that leads to the 1973 Roe versus Wade decision and takes this kind of in what you might call a nuclear argument in terms of how the magnitude of it, and has stayed with us all of these 50 years and has brought us to a day like today. That this is an unprecedented time in history where all of that has kind of coalesced together.
No, that's right. And that's the context to put around it. Why 73? as opposed to 53
Right.
or 33. Those that wrote the majority opinion, I would say, discovered a right to privacy in the 14th Amendment that they used as the basis for allowing for or arguing for a federally protected right to abortion. Well, a lot of the struggle inside this and a lot of what the court appears to be deciding, the majority right now, is that that was horrific legal logic. That this should always have been something not for the courts, but for the Congress to make decisions, that we should elect lawmakers to make these decisions. And these unelected justices, in essence, were doing what the Congress is in position to do, that there is no right to abortion in the Constitution, either literally or implied. And more people are saying that's actually true, that the Supreme Court back in 73 made this enormous reach when it discovered this right that doesn't exist in the Constitution. And so to your point, why in 73? Why would they do that? Well, it's the larger context that you're describing. There really are two ways to see the Constitution. One is to say, I want to be an originalist. I want to be a textualist. I want to interpret the Constitution according to the intended meaning of the Constitution. That would be more a conservative position, you might think. You would think about a number of justices that in recent years have been seen as textualists or originalists. The other approach is the living document idea. The idea that the Constitution can't really be understood in its original context, and that doesn't matter so much anyway. What does it mean for us today? And so in 73, you're in the middle of the so-called sexual revolution. You're in a day, as you said, where you're seeing enormous kind of activism around LGBTQ rights, around pornography, all of that.
And you're so also seeing a growing, there had always been some concern, but there was also just the concern for health of women getting back alley abortions and all kinds of horror stories coming out of that. That's an additional part of the conversation.
And those
as well.
were used more politically than I would think they were used in reality. There were some of those stories, not to the degree that they, I think, were probably portrayed, but nonetheless an issue, you're right. And so all that kind of comes together to congeal in this moment in 73. Well, there was a Roman Catholic bishop a couple of years ago who made, I thought, a very profound point. He said the reason the civil rights movement of the 60s codified into popular consensus is because it was aligned with biblical truth. The Bible is very clear in saying racism is wrong, in saying that God loves each of us as if there were only one of us. As Augustine said, there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. And so that was aligned with biblical truth. And that's why that's settled public policy. Not that we don't still have racism, we still have progress to make, but the civil rights legislation in 1964 is not controversial today. The removal of Jim Crow laws is not controversial. By contrast, we are more divided on abortion than we were in 1973. And his point was that the abortion finding of 73 is in direct conflict with what we know inherently to be true, which is that it's a baby, and that ending the life of the unborn is egregiously wrong. And that's why we're in this conflict 50 years later. In one of her last public statements before her death, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg made the point that she thought Roe v. Wade was an overreach, even though she certainly agreed with its basic position. She felt it was an overreach because the divisiveness that it has produced and that continues forward demonstrates that it was not itself therapeutic for the culture, that it wasn't a good step forward for the culture. And so because it is so in conflict with what we know to be true, it's divisive today on a level that demonstrates, I think, that foundational fact.
And so, so just from that standpoint that you kind of step back from that and say, well, in some ways, Roe v. Wade didn't settle anything.
No.
It changed some things, but it didn't settle anything. Like I said, in this deep, visceral reaction that many of us have to inherently knowing that the taking of an unborn life is the taking of a life. And then, like I said, you can go down so many different trails. You can go down the political trail of this. You can go down the pure legal trail of many lawyers who just point out the weaknesses of the Roe v. Wade case on a legal basis, regardless of how you feel about it morally or spiritually or anything like that. So many different roads that you can go down and that the court is being confronted with. But let's get into this question for a moment that sometimes I've found myself saying, how could you be a Christian and also be pro-choice in our culture? And I find myself trying to get really simplistic in that. But there are Christians who would claim a very clear and strong relationship with Christ, who would also say that they are pro-choice. How do they get to that position, in your opinion?
Yeah, thank you. There are 5 arguments that they'll make, and some they'll hold more than others, depending on the individual. But this is the moral case for abortion, as I understand it. The first argument is that the fetus is not legally a person. They would agree with the Supreme Court's finding in 73 that the Constitution nowhere grants legal standing to preborn life. They would point out that only 40 to 50% of fetuses actually survive to become persons in the full sense. They would see a fetus therefore belongs to the mother until it attains personhood, and it's morally subject to any action that she wishes to take with it. And so in their view, this isn't yet a person. Now, it's potentially a life, of course, but they would say it is not yet a person. And so the mother has the right to decide on this. And many that would say they're pro-choice would also say they're not pro-abortion. They're not hoping she'll choose abortion. They're not wishing she would choose abortion. They just believe she should be the one to make the decision, not the courts.
Right, and even right there, you can see where many times the conversation goes afield. Right, that there would be many who would say under this position, we still passionately hope she doesn't choose abortion, because there's even some evidence and statistics these days, recently, that abortions just overall are going down in number. So there is some feeling within the culture, apparently, that we've, even 50 years later, we've come to this general understanding, perhaps, abortion on the face of it is just not a good thing, even if there is the right to have one.
And that's their argument. Their argument is that I want the mother to make the decision, not the courts.
Right.
I heard somebody recently say that there's not room in the hospital room for the Supreme Court as the mother's making this decision. And so that's essentially an argument that in many ways allows a person to look tolerant and yet biblical. I agree biblically that life begins at conception, but who am I to force my position on somebody else? It's a very postmodern kind of position, isn't it? Yeah. I have my truth, you have your truth. My truth would say life begins at conception. My truth would say I would never choose an abortion for myself. I would never want my daughter, granddaughter to choose an abortion. But I don't think I have the legal right to tell you that you can't do this. I heard a recent analogy to adultery. I certainly think adultery is wrong. I think it's immoral, but it's not illegal. And I'm not sure I want the courts making adultery illegal, taking the issue out of an individual's decisions within their family units and making it something the court decides. And so that's by far the most prevalent argument that you'll hear out there, is that we're a secular democracy.
Right.
We're governed by a constitution, not by the Bible. And at the end of the day, we don't get to impose biblical values on these decisions. The Constitution doesn't specify when life begins. It does obviously say the mother is a person, and so therefore the mother ought to be the one to make the decision, not the courts.
And we can go through these one at a time or in summary fashion, however you choose. But we would obviously say that adultery and abortion are not the same thing.
That's right.
There are different issues at play that you cannot put those as being the same kind of category.
That's right. That's exactly right.
And that the interest, particularly interest in this case of the government and of the state, are different relative to the issue of life fundamentally than they are of marriage and marriage sanctity.
That's right. And one of the places where, just to respond to that first place, which I guess would be a good way to do this, rather than just list them, then come back, let's just kind of deal with them as we go through. The response to that essentially, and this is where science has been so helpful since 1973, is now that we know more and more about the so-called fetus than ever before, it's becoming clearer and clearer that this is a human life.
So yeah, you're talking about the medical technology that's available to us. I know in my work with the Crisis Pregnancy Center, that's where sonograms became so significant in this conversation about verifying, clarifying, and affirming that this is, in fact, a human being from its very earliest days.
That's right. And science is more and more teaching us that. Theologian Karl Barth described the fetus this way: the embryo has its own autonomy, its own brain, its own nervous system, its own blood circulation. If its life is affected by that of the mother, it also affects hers. It can have its own illnesses in which the mother has no part. Conversely, it may be quite healthy even though the mother is seriously ill. It may die while the mother continues to live. It may also continue to live after its mother's death and be eventually saved by a timely operation on her dead body. In short, it is a human being in its own right. Science is teaching us that more and more to be the case. Now, the only argument you can really make against this has to do with viability. The idea that you can decide a human isn't a human until it's viable, and at this point it would be outside the womb. But if you've ever been around a newborn, You understand how not viable a newborn is either. Yes, it can breathe on its own, but it can't feed itself. It can't protect itself. That's one of the arguments for infanticide that tragically is starting to gain some traction in the culture.
Okay, stop right there for a moment and
Yeah.
define that word, because many people just don't come across the word infanticide the way they do the word abortion. Help us understand that distinction.
You bet. Peter Singer and others are moving to a functionalist sort of ethic that would say we ought to prioritize those people who contribute to society. It's almost a utilitarian kind of idea. And so if somebody is terminally ill, we ought not give them the kind of health support that they receive right now. It saps our limited health resources on a level that is not paying back to society. They're not contributing anymore to society. They're simply taking from us. He'd make the same argument for newborns, especially those that might have some challenges, some physical handicaps or challenges, that they're never going to contribute to society on some significant level, productive level. So why are we sacrificing so many of our resources in their behalf?
And even as we just talk about that, you can hear so many families who have a special needs child just immediately alerting as they should, right?
That's right, and protesting as they should.
Right.
I've known numbers of families over the years, for instance, with Down syndrome children, that while they certainly wouldn't have chosen to have a baby with Down, they're so grateful they do. So grateful for all the good that's come from and all the ways that God has blessed them through. And so, yeah, it's a horrific argument. It's, I think, an incredibly immoral argument to make. And my point right now would be that if we say that the unborn child is not a human being because it's not yet viable, you can make exactly that same argument on the other side of birth. And especially if there are physical challenges, whatever the age the person might be, a viability is going to be your standard. And that's the only way really scientifically, medically right now, someone can argue that the child is not a child. So the first argument that's out there, that we don't know when life begins and so the mother should be the only one to make the decision, is really falling in relative to scientific evidence that's there. If you want to make that argument, then the mother also ought to be able to make the decisions about her newborn child, about her 1-year-old, about her 2-year-old, that she alone should decide whether the child lives or dies. That was something the ancient Roman Empire believed. They had patria potestas, the power of the father, that the father had the right to life and death for the child as long as the father lived. Do we want to go there again? Do we want to be at that place where we really do believe that we have categories of viability, categories of value, and that until you can produce on some level that we grade, you are therefore not a viable human being? But that's ultimately where some are going with all this today. So that's the first argument, is we can't decide when life begins, so the mother should make the decision. Science is proving that not to be true.
Viability and value connecting
Exactly.
there. All right. Second argument, the idea of protecting a woman in the case of something extreme like rape or incest.
Right, and that's an argument that is much more rhetorical than it is in real. It's estimated that 93% of abortions in America are elective, that only 7% are fetal deformity, rape, incest, or the life of the mother. So it's a very, very small percentage that we're thinking of here. As regards rape and incest, in this conversation, there are really two positions that the pro-life sort of response can take. One is to say, all right, I'll do a carve-out for that. If I can delegitimize 93% of abortions, I'll take that.
Absolutely.
And a lot on kind of a practical level will go there and not try to fight the battle. There are some that would say, well, look, life begins at conception regardless of how the baby was conceived. And they'll tell stories of people like Ethel Waters, who was herself, I believe, the product of a rape, and stories of people that have lived remarkably valuable lives whose conception was very, very difficult. And so you can make some argument that even rape and incest is not a moral argument. But some in the pro-life position will take that, some will take the other side. But the bottom line is that that's a very small percentage and does not justify the 93% that are themselves elective abortions.
Yeah, and very helpful to get to that kind of clarity, because, again, you start seeing where people pick up arguments, particularly for political reasons or whatever the case might be, just to try to give weight to their position when the numbers really are not significant in that way.
And do it for an emotional reason, if nothing else. If your daughter was raped, if your granddaughter was raped, would you still want abortion to be illegal? This is kind of the way that this moves. And it's really moving it from the argument based on Scripture or based on logic, based on jurisprudence, really to kind of an emotional sort of an approach. And you can see how that could be popular.
Sure. Well, the third reason that a pro-choice person might have is that no child should be brought into the world that's unwanted. On the face of it, that kind of makes sense, but where does that kind of fall apart in terms of a more biblical perspective.
Right, it's on two levels. The first level is to say, well, absolutely, if that's your position, then you ought to be an adoption advocate. There are so many couples who desperately want to be parents, who desperately want to raise children. And so every person who thinks that an unwanted child ought not exist should therefore be a supporter for adoption at that point. A second argument would be to say, if you could ask the unborn child, would you rather die or live? Your mother doesn't really want you to live. She'd rather abort you. Would you rather be aborted because you're not wanted? Or would you rather be given life and then perhaps adoption? Or even if the mother doesn't give you up for adoption, would your worst life not be better than having been aborted? And then you have to factor in the fact that so many mothers, as they're back and forth on this spectrum, might today be thinking, I just can't raise another child. I don't have the financial means to do it. It's going to impede my life. It's going to impede my job. I'm under family pressure. There's all the reasons why women choose abortion. That might change in a week. But abortion's a permanent decision.
Right.
Once that decision's been made. So then we need to measure, what do we mean by unwanted? Is that the mother's decision alone to make? What about the father? What about the grandparents? What about the larger family system? And again, the adoptive parents who would so much want that child to exist. And so the response is to argue for adoption and to also argue against the finality of abortion to give the mother opportunity and again understand, if you were the fetus, which would you choose? Ronald Reagan made the point. He said, I've noticed that everybody that argues for abortion has already been born.
Right. I remember that statement, yeah.
I think that applies to this conversation.
And I remember, again, just my experience of working in this space that a significant amount of ministry that we did touched upon this issue with working with women and sometimes with couples and with men in post-abortive situations, that this whole question of, well, I didn't want to bring a child into the world that I wasn't prepared for or that I didn't want, and then having to work through some of the emotional, spiritual, mental challenges of having made that decision, this very obviously permanent decision for this unborn child, and how they struggle with that, and something that maybe we'll come back to if we have time. I remember it wasn't just so many years ago that I came as a pastor to understand that some of these women and couples were sitting in my church.
Yes.
And that when you come to something like Mother's Day that we'll celebrate this weekend for this year, that brings up a whole other area of pain and challenge and history that you probably won't see it as they walk by you on Sunday morning at your church, but it's there.
It absolutely is. Some years ago, every year in Baptist Life Anyway, we had a Sanctity of Life Sunday, typically in January. So I was pastoring First Baptist Midland. It was my first January to do that. I preached a strong pro-life message. Afterwards, our counseling minister, who'd been on the staff for years and years, and I were talking. He thanked me for the message. He said he certainly agreed with it, but he said something just to know is there are a number of women who heard you say that today who have had abortions. And he would know that, being the longtime counseling minister there in the church, in a way that I wouldn't have known. I hadn't thought of that. I should have, but I hadn't. And you're right. Mother's Day, whatever the conversation, even those hearing this conversation right now, the odds are there's a pretty good chance that somebody that's going to hear this conversation has chosen an abortion at some point along the way. And they will know the guilt that comes from that. They'll know the grief that comes from that. They'll know the long-term pain that's on the other side of that doesn't typically get in the conversation. If somebody is simply arguing that no unwanted child should exist in the world, there can be so much grief on the other side of deciding that the mother didn't want that child. Right. And now knows that that was a decision that was obviously horrific for the child and is going to be pain they'll carry the rest of their lives as well.
Right. A couple more of these arguments for abortion and abortion rights. The state should not have the right to legislate personal morality, what you were referring to a minute ago. That what is the state's interest here? Obviously in persons.
Sure, and that's again one of the arguments that you'll see on the other side. Well, we obviously have an interest for the sake of the mother. The unborn child has no constitutional status as an independent individual, and so the state has no relationship with the unborn child. Has no governance jurisprudence there in that sense, would be an argument that's made here. It's categorically false on a number of logical levels. First of all, because we do understand life to begin at conception. We do understand this to be an unborn life, an unborn human, that the state has absolutely a compelling interest in protecting that child, especially the most innocent among us, especially the most, on some level, those that can least defend themselves are those that the state most has a moral obligation to protect, to defend. That's why the state leans so far in the direction of caring for children when there are divorce proceedings and what will be best for the child as opposed to what would the parents' wishes be. That's why the state has a compelling interest to protect its own citizens. You could argue that's its most basic obligation.
Yeah, you see it on the side of almost every police car and public vehicle, right? To protect and to serve.
Right.
And we would just kind of logically extend it out to protect and to serve the least and most vulnerable among us, children and what you and I believe, unborn children.
Exactly.
That it should extend that far.
In fact, you could argue that's what all laws do.
Right.
All laws legislate morality. The reason the state enforces a seatbelt law is because it believes it has a compelling interest in protecting you if you're in an accident in a way that you may not even want to be protected yourself, but it's going to force you to have that seatbelt. It's going to force the car makers to include safety apparatus in the car, airbags, things like that.
And I don't know if your dad was this way, but my dad fought that the whole time of his experience.
Both my parents.
And didn't he despise seatbelts and this whole idea that the state has an interest and a value in you via a seatbelt, even if you don't have it for yourself.
Sure.
So there are examples where the state has an interest like this in many ways, and perhaps in all of its laws.
My parents hated that. Both of them did. They felt like the state was imposing unfairly on them. It's their decision as to what they want to do about all of this. And at the end of the day, it really wasn't their decision. If they don't wear a seatbelt, we can get into this, but if they don't wear a seatbelt, they're involved in an accident. Others in the car may be more likely to be damaged or injured as well. There are other stories inside it. But the bottom line is, if you believe in seatbelts, if you believe in speed limits, if you believe in the most basic laws, then you're seeing the imposition of morality on the part of the government. And so to say that the government can't legislate morality means it can't do legislation, because all legislation is a legislation of morality, in this case, relative to the most vulnerable among us, and that would be the preborn child.
Yeah. Great explanation. Kind of the last major argument that is for abortion and abortion rights is that the woman must be permitted to make pregnancy decisions in light of her own life circumstances. We've touched on that a little bit, flesh that a little bit more and what the response to that is. Obviously, part of that being that she's not the only one that is considering the circumstances as well. This child has circumstances to consider as well.
And that's really a lot of the argument that's inside this. A lot of what Roe v. Wade argued around was that we need to take into consideration the emotional health of the mother, the financial health of the mother, the life stage where she finds herself, and really give precedence to her issues if we must choose. But it's seen as a zero-sum game, where we have to choose either the mother or the child, and so we're going to choose the mother on constitutional grounds. Well, again, that logic is so flawed. We now understand the child to be a child. We would never make that argument about a 1-year-old, never make that argument about a 3-year-old, and yet we're making that about a child. From the moment of birth forward, the state has a compelling interest to protect that child, that it didn't have 5 minutes ago before the child was born,
right.
But now 5 minutes, all the child has done is move locations. It's moved a foot or two from inside the womb to outside the womb, and in that moment, it has equal status in the eyes of the law that it didn't have 5 minutes earlier, is the argument that's being made here. I also would want to emphatically make the case that a pro-life supporter like me is not part of a war on women, as this is often seen to be. I believe abortion to be damaging to women as well, as we talked about a moment ago. I, as a pastor, over 4 decades, have seen so much devastation in the lives of women who have chosen abortion. I've seen that with the biological father. I've seen that with the grandparents, the extended family, as you mentioned a moment ago as well. I certainly myself would argue for the life of the mother if one must choose. The life of the mother, that would be a circumstance by which I would say abortion would therefore be morally defensible. But apart from the very survival of the mother, how do we grade this? How do we grade financial well-being? Right. How do we grade emotional well-being? How do we make decisions like that? How do the courts make these decisions? So at the end of the day, we want both. We're rejecting the zero-sum nature of this, and we're wanting to argue for the life of the mother and the life of the child. And we believe there are absolutely, positively ways to do both.
Yeah. Well, that's what we hope people will be able to get some clarity around. Couple of questions just to kind of use our remaining time. I know that we could spend so much more time talking about this. But as Christians think through this, as we try to go to our Bibles, Jim, to understand this, there is no clear, simple, easy scripture and verse that Christians can go to. But how would you advise our listeners in that area? We started off this, like I said, you can find this resource on our website by simply saying, what does the Bible say about abortion? From a biblical perspective, just simply that text of the Bible, where would you take people in terms of building their biblical as well as theological and practical understanding of this issue?
Yeah, it's a great question. The challenge that is before us here is that the Bible nowhere says, thou shalt not have an abortion. It doesn't say those words. The reason it doesn't say those words is that abortion was so forbidden in the Jewish culture of the biblical era, it didn't need to say that. It didn't need to forbid that per se because it was absolutely categorically clear in ancient Judaism. We get this in the Talmud. We get this Babylonian Talmud as well as in other documents. We get this in Sanhedrin documents. It's again and again emphatically stated in Judaism that life begins at conception and that abortion is wrong. It's really when you get outside the biblical era and the church starts getting out into the larger Greco-Roman world that you get the Epistle of Barnabas, which is a late 1st century, early 2nd century document which forbids abortion. You start seeing very clear categorical statements by early Christian fathers forbidding abortion once the church starts getting out into a culture that accepts abortion.
And they're working out their implications of their
That's
faith
right.
in contrast to their unbelieving culture.
Exactly so. But relative to a case against abortion in Scripture, the Bible again and again, I think, makes it very clear. Life begins at conception. You find that in Psalm 139, where David very clearly says to God, you formed my inward parts, you knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes beheld my unformed substance. In your book were written all the days formed for me when none of them yet existed. You've got Jeremiah 1:5. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I consecrated you. You've got Luke 1:39-45, where the unborn child in Elizabeth's womb leaped when Mary came in, clearly cognizant of what we're dealing with here. We're also talking about the rights of the innocent that again and again are made clear in Scripture. Exodus 23:7, do not kill the innocent, and those in the right, for I will not acquit the guilty. So again and again, the Bible explains clearly that the innocent are to be protected, that life begins at conception. The fact that the Bible does not say thou shalt or shalt not have an abortion is because in the culture it wasn't necessary. Because in the Jewish culture of the day, abortion was simply forbidden. It wasn't even considered as an option one might consider. When you get outside that Jewish culture is when the unanimous position of the church starts becoming clear as regards forbidding abortion per se.
And that so many indications, obviously, from start to finish, right? The Bible begins in a garden, it ends in a garden, and everything in between is an affirmation of this incredible gift of life. I think every time I come across this, Genesis 2:7, God breathed into human beings His breath of life, and the first man, Adam, became a living being. That everything that God is about being pro-life, and that Scripture points in that direction in every single aspect, in every single way, which really kind of comes down to the core issue of what we wanted to try to get at today, right? If people were going away from this, we're gonna give them, before we wrap up, just a few practical things to think about how they can be praying, how they can be listening, how they can engage in this, perhaps. But the core issue is one we've already touched upon in a couple of different ways. Put it in the words that you want to share it.
I'd be glad to do that. At that point, I'd like to quote Mother Teresa.
Okay.
I don't know how I could quote anybody that has higher moral authority, whatever the subject might be, than her. She was writing to the United States Supreme Court as it was considering petitions related to abortion, and she made this statement. Your opinion, this was in Roe v. Wade, stated that you did not need to, quote, resolve the difficult question of when life begins, end quote. That question, she writes, is inescapable. If the right to life is an inherent and inalienable right, as obviously the Declaration of Independence states that it is, she says, it must surely obtain wherever human life exists. No one can deny that the unborn child is a distinct being, that it is human, and that it is alive. It is unjust, therefore, to deprive the unborn child of its fundamental right to life on the basis of its age, size, or condition of dependency. It was a sad infidelity to America's highest ideals when the court said that it did not matter or could not be determined when the inalienable right to life began for a child in its mother's womb. And she's been widely quoted as stating, "It is a deep poverty to decide that a child must die so that you may live as you wish."
What a profound statement.
It truly is.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, that's something that just kind of keeps you up at night as far as I'm concerned.
Yes, I agree.
And to think about that in terms of a post-truth, post-morality culture thinks that way, that it needs to be about what works for me, and it doesn't really matter what works for somebody else, even this unborn child.
Aren't you glad your mother didn't make the same choice?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. This conversation is just part of a bigger conversation in this story around where the Supreme Court may be headed is just one more page and chapter in an ongoing situation and as you said, the moral defining issue of our day. So even if in a few weeks or months the Supreme Court comes out and does overturn Roe v. Wade, what would you likely expect to see happen? We already know. You look at Texas, you look at California, a number of other states. There are trigger laws. So there will be so much more that happens either way. But what would you tell us just kind of generally to expect? But then also more importantly, as believers, redemptively.
Good.
How should we be preparing and engaging?
Now, thank you. If Roe v. Wade is overturned, what will happen is this will become a states' rights issue, which is what it was prior to 1973,
and
what I think it always should have been.
So help us a little bit with political science. A states' rights issue, which means it can be worked out in the states, is also could be coming back to the Congress. Even today, there's a headline that the president has asked the Congress to engage. So there's two different kind of tracks to that. So
That's right.
Speak to that a little bit so we understand the difference.
Sure, yeah, and that's a great point. One way that this could work would be to say Congress ought to pass a federal law that legitimizes abortion. That was never done. What the Supreme Court did took this out of Congress's hands, took it out of elected officials' hands, and 9 unelected justices discovered a right to abortion in the Constitution.
And some would say they did what is only the responsibility of the Congress.
That's right. And that's been one of the major arguments against Roe v. Wade from the beginning. As you said earlier, regardless what you think of abortion per se, the fact that, in essence, the court did what the Congress was supposed to do here. And at the end of the day, you don't want the courts making law. You want the courts interpreting law. You want the Congress to make the law.
Right.
So one push forward could be to try to do a federal sort of a law. That doesn't look as though that's going to have any kind of traction. That would have to get past a filibuster in the Senate. It could pass the House, but in all likelihood would not pass the Senate. And so in all likelihood, there would not be a successful effort to federalize abortion on that level. So then it becomes a state-by-state issue. Depending on who you look at, anywhere from 24 to 26 states have made decisions already that if Roe v. Wade is overturned, abortion would then become illegal in their state on any level. Now, some would say to protect the life of the mother, some would have rape and incest, some would have fetal deformity kind of carve-outs, and so it depends on the state, but about half the states would have some sort of laws that they've already put in place or likely would put in place to make abortion illegal in their state. The other half would, as California would and has already decided, would have laws that would absolutely endorse abortion at any point across all 9 months for any reason whatsoever. One of the most extreme abortion laws of all time was recently passed in California and would be their position if Roe v. Wade were overturned. So what the practical consequence of all that looks like, and we'll end there, what are the practical issues here? First of all, understand that we're not going to make abortion go away through legislative means. That's simply not going to happen. Even if Roe v. Wade is overturned, it then becomes a state's issue. And even within the states, you have the ability to travel to states that do have abortion available, and you have medical abortion available through pills that can be procured. The New York Times has calculated that since Texas passed a very restrictive law some time ago, a few months ago, the number of abortions in abortion clinics in Texas fell by half. But the number of women seeking abortions who traveled to adjacent states where it was available, plus those getting medical abortions, were such that the actual zero-sum end of the day abortion rate only fell by 10%. And so because abortion is going to be available medically through pills, pharmaceutical abortions, and traveling to other states, you couldn't think that if Roe falls, and if you live in a state that makes abortion illegal, that therefore there won't be an issue about abortion in your state. That would not be the case for you.
Right. It'll just take different forms.
Different forms, exactly. I would be grateful for this to be the case. I certainly would. I would want abortion to be as limited as I could get it to. But on a practical level, there are three things then that we need to be doing as believers. The first thing that we can be doing, obviously, we always say this, but it's so true, and that is to be praying. God, what's my role here? What would you have me do? Is there somebody I know that is considering an abortion? Is there a crisis pregnancy center I should be volunteering in and serving? Is there a board like you've served on where I could be supporting? Are there financial means I could be giving? Is there a way I could personally be helping women where I live in my Jerusalem choose life? And what would that be, God? How would you have me do this? What can I be doing, Lord? What difference can I make today? That's the first thing to be asking and praying about and thinking about, looking toward. Second, how can my influence make a difference? We all have social media influence. Our cell phone is now a megaphone, and we can do things to make public our positions in ways that may influence others with whom we don't have personal direct interaction. We can influence legislators. We can influence those in the press. We can use our political and personal influence in a way that can advocate for life as well. And then third, let's not just be pro-birth, let's be pro-life. We ought to be as concerned, not only about the unborn, but about those that are born and about their lives and the quality of their lives. That's why poverty ought to be a grievous issue for us, and racism needs to be an issue for us. Now, these are not life and death issues on the same level, I understand that, but they nonetheless are part of a pro-life ethic, not just a pro-birth ethic. And we want to be known as people that advocate for the abundant life Jesus intends in all its manifestations. Let's be those people. Let's be on that front of this. Let's be people offering living water to people that come for water. Let's be those people that offer the good news of the grace of God. This is not a war on women. This is actually, as you said earlier, a spiritual war for the abundant life, the flourishing God intends for every human being. How can we be a means to that end?
Absolutely. What a good word. And as we often say around here, how can we, in every one of those practical ways, speak the truth in love?
Yes.
That we are called and that we are passionate about being cultural missionaries, even when there are people that don't see this issue the way believers do or way many of us do. If you're finding somebody and you're a person of pro-life conviction and you're talking to somebody who is pro-choice, that you still must live out the gospel.
That's right.
In a cultural missionary, speaking the truth in love kind of way.
They are not the enemy.
Because you cannot, especially in something of this nature, but in other areas as well, you don't argue people into changing their mind.
In fact, you may push them away.
You may push them further away.
Side. And if you know someone who's chosen abortion, they're a victim. We often quote our friend John Stonestreet, ideas have consequences, bad ideas have victims. This is Exhibit A of that. They especially need our ministry. Now we're not endorsing the decision to care about the person.
Right.
If that were the case, you could never minister to a sinner
right.
on any level, right?
No.
So we want to be ministering to them. We want to be the church. Someone said the church is the only army that buries its wounded. We don't want to be that army.
Right.
We want to be those folk who are reaching out in grace to those who have made tragic decisions, because we've all made tragic decisions, in a way that offers the grace that we've received. So let's be those advocates of hope and those advocates of love, and let's be the hands and feet of Jesus today.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for the conversation, Dr. Jim. I hope it's been helpful to our audience. I believe it will be. Again, if you want to do some more reading in this area, you can read Dr. Denison's article on the Denison Forum website, denisonforum.org. Simple search, what does the Bible say about abortion? You'll find even more resources there. There'll be more in the daily article and in other resources coming out on our website. We hope that it'll be helpful to you. We hope that you'll use not only your prayer life, but your influence, as Dr. Denison said, and that God will use us to shine His light into this darkness. Thank you for being a part of our conversation.